How do us educators measure the effectiveness of our teaching? And how would we know if our teaching in the studio, in the rehearsal room, or in the performance space has really impacted learning in some form? Hi, my name is Edmund Chow. I'm the program leader in MA Arts Pedagogy and Practice here at LaSalle. Now, in this introductory video, I will share 5 common research methodologies that us educators use, with examples from research articles as well as from my postgraduates. So let's begin. 1. Quantitative or empirical methods. Generally speaking, educators love to measure the impact of their teaching on students' learning. We are interested to find the correlation between 2 or more variables. For example, from the research in drama education, Mike Fleming's team investigated the impact of drama on pupils' language, mathematics, and attitude in 2 primary schools. From the Journal of Research in Music Education, Craig and Irene Peary examined the effects of exposure to classical music on the musical preferences of preschool children. Here we have 2 variables. One is the artistic medium, and the other could be attitudes, behaviors, or test scores in certain subjects. Let's use an example here. Let's just say we want to see if dance produces a higher test score in mathematics. There are 2 ways of going about it. Firstly, we can have a control group and an experimental group. Let's call Class A the control group, and students from Class B will be the experimental group. So Class A are not exposed to dance, whereas students from Class B are given training in dance. And at the end of, say, 4 dance classes, both Class A and Class B take the same maths test. The scores from both classes are compared. Now, with those results, we are able to statistically find if the difference in mean scores was due to chance or due to the dance intervention. Now, in this statistical method, we use the t-test. If our t-test procedures produces a t-value of probability of 0.01, we can then state with a degree of confidence that the results occurred not by chance, because that would be 1 out of 100 times. But the difference is found in our sample. So there is a strong correlation that the intervention of dance worked. Now, the second empirical method is quite similar, except that we have what we call pretest and posttest, with the same class going through dance before and after the dance intervention. Class A takes a maths test, and their score becomes a pretest score. And after 4 sessions of dance, students from Class A take the same maths test again, and both scores are compared statistically to see if the dance intervention had a strong correlation on their mathematical test scores. Now, only with these quantitative empirical methods can the researcher confidently make generalizations about the impact of dance or other art form on students' learning. Now, my top student from the last cohort, Hector Lee from Music Production and Audio Engineering, hypothesized that the Digital Audio Workstation, or DAW, had too much visual information on the interface, and that it did not help to sharpen the listening skills of the learner during the audio mixing process. So he decided to do a series of experiments to remove visual indicators on the user interface. In his experiments, his results show that such an approach reduced cognitive load on the student's working memory, which therefore enhanced their learning process. Second, action research. Unlike the empirical methods that often begin with a hypothesis, action research is a research design inspired by a real problem in the classroom. So we start the first cycle of intervention by planning. In the planning phase, you identify the questions. You start to collect data and interview people. Could be people from teachers to principals and management to administrators and even janitors. What are my students struggling with? Why? And you probe deeper. And then in the acting phase of the action research cycle, you implement an intervention to see if it helps to address that problem. Then you observe. You collect more data on the ground, interview the same people, and analyze the effects that intervention might have. You report the findings to the first group of participants and ask them for more feedback. In most cases, a new question or problem may emerge from this cycle. And then as a researcher, you reflect again on what it might mean and what new strategies and theories and frameworks you can use to address this new situation. Now you probably ask, what can I do about this situation? Is my evaluation of the situation valid? How do I modify my practice next? And then you start the second cycle of interventions and continue with the number of cycles until that community, that classroom space or that school environment feels that this has been resolved. As you can see, in most cases, the entire school or the community may be involved in this, and that is why it is often known as participatory action research. One article from Arts Journal looked at developing a fairer, more transparent fine art curriculum and assessment framework. Another article from Drama Australia Journal looked at improving the quality of school life for students and teachers. From my program, Daniel Jenkins had a student in his acting class with a problem. Dan's student was not able to feel any emotions while doing character work in his acting class. So Dan decided to use music as an intervention to understand the effects of music on emotions and on acting. Similar to the control and experimental group in empirical research, Dan adapted it and had 2 cycles of interventions. In the first cycle, he conducted the experiment with diploma and performance students, and in the second cycle with professional actors. In each cycle, there were 3 parts. Part 1 consisted of music listening and reflections, both as an individual and as a pairing. Part 2 introduced a monologue test. And part 3 investigated scene work as a stimulus through the use of improv with both personal and collective music. His data collections included audio, video, recordings, reflections, free writing, drawings, interviews, and many more. So cycle 1 sparked interesting findings about episodic memory, about narratives, about emotional associations with certain types of music. But by the time cycle 2 ended, the findings were quite different and a lot more deeper in his findings. This time, fictitious images and visualizations emerged which were not related to the actors' personal stories. And that was interesting. So Dan Jenkins concluded that music was able to spark the participants' imagination, creativity, and freedom. Next, autoethnography. To understand autoethnography, we need to break the word apart. Auto and ethnography. Let's deal with ethnography first. Like an anthropologist who enters a space that is considered new or foreign, an ethnographer may enter your classroom your studio or your performance to understand the social, political, or cultural dynamics that affect relationships, attitudes, values, and even learning. They would usually conduct interviews with many people, ranging from teachers and students to people in the management or even administrators, technicians, caretakers, and even janitors whose participation in the community life has some form of influence on the research study. So they observe what is happening before, during, and after each session. Now, in reality, ethnography is very difficult to do because it is extremely time consuming. So a smaller version of it can be considered a case study, which I will not cover in this video. But in cases where researchers have very little access to participants' life stories, for example in a prison or hospital setting where you might need to go through months of security and ethics clearance, autoethnography is a qualitative method to research on the researcher's experience being on site instead. The prefix auto in Greek here means self. Autoethnography means researching the researcher's lived experiences. Data collection methods are still pretty much the same. Observation notes, field notes, interviews, surveys, and whatever documentation you can have. In an arts class, you might look at the designs, the products, the creative process, journals, as well as the performances put up by this group of participants. This article from Qualitative Inquiry positioned autoethnography as an intimate method of knowledge inquiry, especially in performing arts where sensations and feelings are felt, are visceral, are corporeal, are fleeting. Tammy Spry's research methodology is both autoethnography as well as practice research, which I will talk about later on. Now, because of that, sometimes the way to represent those sensations are through images, poems, and stories, which is quite common within autoethnographies. My student who teaches film used autoethnography to reflect on his personal life journey as a filmmaker who had influenced him, and then he incorporated scripts into his dissertation. This is Jasmine Tan, and he started a script in his thesis and even had a dialogue with Gilles Deleuze, a dead European philosopher who inspired him to look at film as a body without organs. Very interesting read. Autography is a considerably new research methodology that investigates the three identities of the researcher. That is, you as the artist, you as the researcher, and you as the teacher, ART. As such, the writing often takes on a narrative, autoethnography kind of style. The form is free flow. It can be incredibly aesthetic in its layout with images, designs, poems, music, notations, and the like. As you can see from this PhD dissertation from Brigham Young University, who focused on the study of dress and identities. Data collection methods are pretty much the same. Few notes of your teaching, interviews with your participants, journal reflections as a practitioner, creative process journal reflections by students, and audio-visual video recordings. In my last cohort, Lydia Crispins, who teaches fashion, used autoethnography and created her own methodology called blind draping. Now, she claims that traditional method of fashion making is very visual and that design is output driven. In Lydia's research with one student, which potentially is a case study, involves working with this student through a very long process and working through the emotions and working through the imagination. And because she did not start with a research question, her experiment is process driven by how her student feels and what she's imagining and how to translate that into the final design. For example, her student was at Scape Park in Orchard Road, and with her eyes closed, she was listening to the sounds from the environment. And so she journaled it down and translated those sounds and images from her own creative process journal into streetwear design, a design that received the highest mark in that student's cohort. Now, practice research, this type of research aims to illuminate or bring about new knowledge and understanding through creativity and practice. This often leads to products and outputs that may not be text-based, but rather a performance such as music, dance, drama, installation, design film, or even exhibition. Methods of data collection are usually audiovisual, journals, and analysis of artistic processes and products. In her MA thesis, Durga Devi Manimaran, who is a Bharatanatyam dancer, says that the problem in classical Indian dance is that the form has been rigidly codified and the teaching is very authoritarian. As you can know, the guru says something and then the student sort of imitates whatever the guru teaches. So whatever the teacher says is right, and this led to her students feeling rather incompetent because the dance form is rather unattainable. Now, there is no specific method within practice research, but Durga wanted to introduce Michael Chekhov's acting techniques to break the neural pathway in creating characters and expressing emotions. Now, hers is very much like the pretest and post-test experiment, where dancers performed a piece first, and then after going through Chekhov's acting exercises, they re-choreographed the same piece. Now, this time there is more dynamism in the performance, where the gestures are fluid and uninhibited, and individual personalities and interpretations were evident in the final piece. I've only mentioned 5 research methodologies in arts education, but there are a lot more methodologies that you can look at, including narrative inquiry, case studies, performance ethnographies, grounded theories, etc. What is important in any implementation of an MA research project is to narrow down your research question into something that can be looked at with rigor. So instead of looking at your arts discipline in general, look at what you can have access to in terms of space, in terms of the number of participants, as well as the limitations of your time. You won't want to have many unpredictable factors affecting your research design. Then decide what aspects of your art discipline or art form that you can zoom into. For example, it could be movement, breath, engagement with art materials, voice, stories, rituals. And then with theoretical support from your literature review, find a systematic way of asking questions, recording, interpreting, and presenting your data. Now that's it for now. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you.